"You're not joining the cruise." Her son's text read, arriving just as Margaret Whitmore stood in her bedroom with a half-packed suitcase open on the quilt she had sewn 30 years earlier. For a long moment, she simply stared at the glowing screen, certain she had misunderstood. Certain there had to be another message coming right behind it explaining that this was some mistake. Some awkward joke sent too quickly between errands. But no second message came. The room remained still except for the ticking of the brass clock on her dresser, and the low hum of the air conditioner fighting the July heat outside. Margaret lowered herself slowly onto the edge of the bed, her fingers tightening around the phone until her knuckles blanched. 3 days ago, Daniel had mentioned the cruise in passing over Sunday dinner. 7 days through the Caribbean. A family getaway before the children went back to school. Vanessa had smiled across the table and said, "It'll be nice for everyone to get away together." Everyone. Margaret had heard the word clearly. She had heard it the way any mother would hear it, naturally assuming that after spending 38 years raising Daniel, after helping with the down payment on their first house, after babysitting every Thursday night so they could have time as a couple, she was still included when her son said the word family. So she had gone shopping on Monday and bought herself a pale blue resort dress she thought would look lovely on deck at sunset. She had even purchased a wide-brimmed straw hat from the department store downtown, laughing softly to herself when the young cashier told her it looked elegant. Now the hat sat on the dresser beside her like evidence of foolishness. Her phone buzzed again. Another text. Vanessa thought it would be better if this was just immediate family. Hope you understand. Margaret read that sentence 3 times. Immediate family. The words landed with a quiet cruelty that hurt more than if he had shouted them. She set the phone face down beside her and looked around the room, suddenly unable to recognize the life she had spent decades building. Framed photographs lined the walls. Daniel at 8 with missing front teeth and grass stains on his jeans. Daniel at 17 in his graduation cap. Daniel on his wedding day with his hand over hers as he whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mom." She had believed him then. She had believed gratitude lasted longer than wedding vows and mortgage payments and children and promotions. Apparently, she had been wrong. Margaret stood and crossed to the closet, her movements slow, mechanical. She lifted the blue dress from its hanger and carefully slid it back into the garment bag. Then the sandals. Then the sun hat. Then the printed itinerary she had requested online after hearing about the trip. The one she had folded neatly and tucked into her purse as if she belonged in those plans. She placed each item away with the same deliberate calm one might use handling fragile glass. Her reflection in the mirror startled her when she looked up. 68. Margaret had aged gracefully, silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, posture still straight, face lined more by thought than by time. But in that moment, she looked older. Not because of age. Because humiliation had a way of adding years all at once. She picked up her phone again and typed carefully. "Of course. I understand. Have a wonderful trip." Daniel responded with a thumbs up. Nothing more. No epaleyi. No explanation. Just that little symbol floating on the screen like an afterthought. Margaret stared at it until her vision blurred, then set the phone aside. Outside her bedroom window, the neighborhood children rode bicycles up and down the sidewalk, their laughter drifting faintly through the glass. Light, indifferent and ordinary, continued as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Something fundamental. Because as Margaret stood in the silence of her bedroom, surrounded by the memories of a family she had once believed she was the center of, one terrible realization settled into her chest with icy certainty. No one excludes you by accident when they've had months to plan a cruise. The next morning, Margaret woke before sunrise out of habit, though there was nowhere she needed to be and no one expecting her. Pale light spilled through the kitchen curtains as she moved through the familiar motions of her morning routine, grinding coffee beans, setting a single mug on the counter, slicing toast she did not really want. The silence in the house felt different now. Not peaceful. Not restful. It felt like the kind of silence that settles after someone has said something cruel and left the room, leaving the words behind to echo against the walls. She carried her coffee to the breakfast nook and sat in the chair that faced the backyard garden she had spent 20 years tending. The roses were in bloom, bright and full against the white fence, but even they seemed strangely distant to her this morning. Her phone remained face down beside her untouched. Daniel had not texted again. Not to apologize. Not to explain. Not even to soften the insult with the kind of empty reassurance people offer when they know they have done wrong but lack the courage to admit it. Margaret told herself she should not be surprised. This was not the first time she had been pushed gently to the edge of their lives, and expected to pretend she had chosen to stand there. Last Thanksgiving, Vanessa had called 2 days before dinner with a tight little laugh, and said they were keeping the gathering small this year. Then Margaret had opened social media that evening and seen photos of a full dining table. Every seat occupied except the one that should have been hers. Christmas. Daniel claimed the children had fevers and they would celebrate privately. Only for Margaret to learn later from a neighbor that the entire family had spent the day at Vanessa's sister's house opening gifts in matching pajamas. In February, her granddaughter's piano recital had somehow been rescheduled, after Margaret had already arrived at the school auditorium, dressed in her Sunday coat and carrying flowers, only to find the event had ended 2 hours earlier. Each time, there had been an explanation, a misunderstanding, a scheduling mix-up, a forgotten detail, and each time Margaret had accepted it because the alternative was uglier than she wanted to believe. The alternative meant admitting that exclusion repeated often enough stopped being coincidence and became intention. She stared into her coffee until it cooled untouched. Memory after memory rose to the surface now with cruel clarity, fitting together like puzzle pieces she had refused to arrange before. Vanessa always handled the scheduling. Vanessa always sent the invitations. Vanessa always answered questions for Daniel before he could speak. And Daniel, once the boy who used to beg his mother not to leave the room when thunderstorms rattled the windows, now moved through life as though keeping his wife comfortable required making his mother invisible. Margaret closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, pressing trembling fingers to her temple. The realization did not arrive dramatically, came quietly, with the slow ache of understanding. This had not started with the cruise. The cruise was simply the first time they had stopped pretending. She rose from the table and walked into the living room, where a framed family portrait sat on the mantel from 2 summers earlier. Everyone was smiling in coordinated white and navy at the beach house Margaret had paid to rent for the family reunion. She remembered how proud she had felt that day, seeing her family together because of something she provided. But now she noticed what she had not let herself notice then. Vanessa standing at the center beside Daniel, the grandchildren in front of them, and Margaret positioned at the very edge of the frame, half-turned, almost cut off by the border. She stood there for a long time, staring at that photograph until the truth settled fully in her chest. They had not suddenly decided she did not belong. They had been moving her out of the picture for years. She had simply been too loyal to see it. By the 3rd day after the text, Margaret understood something almost more painful than the exclusion itself. Daniel had not called because, in his mind, there was nothing to discuss. To him, this was settled, reasonable, normal. She moved through her week in silence, tending the garden, folding laundry, watering the ferns on the porch. But every ordinary task now felt sharpened by memory. Once she allowed herself to look honestly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. She remembered the summer barbecue 2 years earlier when Vanessa had smiled sweetly and said they had forgotten to mention the date had changed, though Margaret later overheard her grandson telling a neighbor that everyone had been there all afternoon before she arrived. She remembered showing up to Emma's dance recital with a bouquet of pink carnations, only to be told at the front desk that the performance had happened the night before. Vanessa had apologized with such polished ease that Margaret had doubted her own hearing. She remembered Daniel selling the old lake cabin his father had left him without mentioning it until the paperwork was already complete, despite knowing Margaret had spent every summer there for 25 years. "We figured it was time to simplify," he had said, as if erasing family history were a practical decision instead of a betrayal. Each memory returned now stripped of the excuses she had wrapped around it at the time. What she once called oversight now looked like strategy. What she once called busyness now looked like avoidance. And what she once called Vanessa's strong personality now looked very much like control. On Friday afternoon, Margaret drove to the grocery store for a few things she did not need simply because sitting in the house had become unbearable. She was standing near the produce section, examining strawberries she had no intention of buying, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Margaret? Honey, are you all packed for the big cruise?" She turned to see Linda Carver, a longtime family friend whose children had grown up with Daniel. Margaret forced a polite smile, though her stomach tightened instantly. "I beg your pardon?" Linda blinked. "The family cruise. Vanessa was telling everyone at the club on Tuesday how much planning it took getting 3 generations organized for one trip. She said the whole family was going except for your sister because of her hip surgery." Margaret felt the world go strangely still around her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Shopping carts rattled past. Somewhere a child was crying for cookies, but all of it sounded far away. 3 generations? Margaret repeated quietly. Linda's cheerful expression faltered. "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I thought you knew," Vanessa said. She stopped, her face draining of color as realization hit. Margaret smiled with more grace than she felt. "No, Linda. Apparently I did not know." She finished her shopping in a fog she could barely remember afterward. Back home, she set the grocery bags on the counter and stood motionless in the kitchen for nearly a minute, one hand braced against the granite. 3 generations. Vanessa had described the trip publicly as a gathering of the whole family, while privately telling Margaret she did not belong on it. Not an awkward oversight. Not a misunderstanding. A deliberate erasure so complete that the world was meant to believe Margaret had simply chosen not to attend. The humiliation of that truth burned hotter than the original text. It was one thing to be excluded in private. It was another to be written out of your own family so thoroughly that other people assumed your absence was voluntary. Margaret sank into a kitchen chair and stared at nothing. Then, slowly, the hurt inside her began to change shape. It did not lessen. It hardened, because pain could make a woman cry. But clarity made her dangerous. And for the first time in a very long while, Margaret stopped asking herself why they had done this and began asking a far more useful question. How much of her life had they built assuming she would keep accepting it? Margaret spent the next morning in her home office with the door closed and a yellow legal pad in front of her, something she had not done in years. At first she only meant to distract herself by organizing paperwork. But as she opened drawers and filing cabinets, another pattern began to emerge with unsettling speed. There was the monthly transfer she had been sending Daniel for the past 4 years to help with the children's private school tuition, even though both he and Vanessa earned more than enough to cover it themselves. There was the mortgage assistance she had quietly provided when interest rates rose and Daniel complained about cash flow being tight. There were checks for summer camps, orthodontist bills, emergency home repairs, birthday gifts that cost more than many people spent on vacations, and the college account she had been contributing to for each grandchild since the day they were born. Margaret sat back slowly, pen suspended over paper, and stared at the numbers adding up in neat columns before her. She had known she helped them often. She had not known just how much of their comfort had been subsidized by the woman they now considered optional. She pulled open another drawer and found the folder containing the trust documents she had created after Harold died 8 years earlier. She remembered sitting across from her attorney with swollen eyes and trembling hands, insisting that everything she and Harold had built should one day benefit Daniel and his children. Family first. She had said then, because that was how she had lived her whole life. The phrase now felt almost laughable. She read every page of the trust with a steadiness that surprised even her. Daniel remained the primary beneficiary. The grandchildren would inherit after him. Margaret had structured everything under the assumption that love and loyalty flowed naturally between parent and child. That assumption no longer seemed wise. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the front door. She folded the papers away and opened it to find her neighbor, Eleanor, holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. "I made too much lasagna," Eleanor said, then studied Margaret's face. "That is a lie. I made the normal amount, but you look like someone should not be eating alone tonight." Margaret almost laughed. Instead, she invited her in. They sat at the kitchen table while Eleanor poured iced tea and spoke in the straightforward way only old friends can. "Something is wrong," she said finally. Margaret hesitated, then told her. Not dramatically, not tearfully, just the facts. The cruise, the text, Linda's comment at the store. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her mouth tightening more with every sentence. When Margaret finished, Eleanor set down her glass with deliberate care. "I am going to tell you something as your friend, and you can hate me for it if you want." Margaret gave a tired smile. "Go on." Eleanor leaned forward. "People do not disrespect you once by accident. They disrespect you repeatedly because they believe there will be no consequences." The words landed with uncomfortable precision. Margaret looked down at her hands folded neatly in her lap. The same hands that had packed Daniel's school lunches, sewn his Halloween costumes, held him through fevers and heartbreak and every disappointment of childhood. Somewhere along the way, she had mistaken endless giving for unconditional love. She had taught him she would always absorb the hurt quietly. She had taught him she would forgive before he even asked. She had taught them all that she could be pushed aside and still remain available when needed. Eleanor stood to leave an hour later, squeezing Margaret's shoulder on her way out. "Stop rewarding people for making you feel small," she said gently. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen after the door closed, staring at the stack of trust papers on the table where she had left them. Then she sat down again, opened the folder, and reached for her phone. If Daniel and Vanessa wanted to redefine what family meant, Margaret thought calmly, then perhaps it was time the paperwork reflected that new definition. Margaret met with her attorney the following Tuesday in a quiet office overlooking the courthouse square, carrying the same leather folder she had brought years earlier when she first drafted her estate plan after Harold's death. Back then, she had cried halfway through the meeting while explaining that everything she and her husband built should remain in the family. This time, she did not cry at all. Her attorney, Robert Finch, adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the documents and then looked up with careful professionalism. "You are certain you want to make these changes?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "I am certain." Robert nodded once and began outlining the revisions. Daniel's inheritance would be reduced to a modest fixed amount. The majority of the estate would instead be placed into protected educational trusts for the grandchildren, inaccessible to their parents. The discretionary family assistance fund Margaret had created for emergencies would be dissolved entirely. The property designated to pass directly to Daniel would be transferred to a charitable foundation supporting widows in financial hardship, an organization Margaret had quietly volunteered with for years. By the time she signed the final page, her hand was perfectly steady. Walking out of that office, she felt no triumph, only a strange and unfamiliar peace. For the first time in years, she had made a decision based not on guilt, not on obligation, not on fear of disappointing her son, but on clear-eyed reality. The cruise departed 2 days later. Margaret knew because Vanessa posted a photograph from the port before the ship even left dock. There they stood in matching white linen, smiling into the sun with the caption, "Family vacation begins now. Grateful for every moment together." Margaret stared at the screen for several seconds before setting her phone aside. Not anger, not jealousy, just confirmation. They had no shame about what they had done because they believed she would do what she had always done, quietly absorb the insult and remain available afterward. She spent that week differently than she might have in years past. She had lunch with Eleanor at a cafe downtown. She attended a museum exhibit she had postponed 3 times because Daniel had needed help with childcare. She booked a weekend trip for herself to Charleston in the fall simply because she had always wanted to go, and had spent too much of her life waiting for someone else's schedule to permit her happiness. With each small decision, the fog inside her mind lifted a little more. Then, on the 6th day of the cruise, her phone rang. Daniel. Margaret let it ring twice before answering. "Hello, dear." His voice came through rushed and distracted, the sound of chatter and wind behind him. "Mom. Hey. Quick favor. We are extending the trip by 2 days because Vanessa found a great deal. But the house sitter can only stay through Friday. Can you stop by and take care of the dog this weekend?" Margaret smiled faintly at the kitchen window, where late afternoon sunlight warmed the counters. There it was. Not an apology. Not remorse. Just expectation. She was still useful. After all. "No," she said pleasantly. Silence. Then, "No?" As though he had misheard her. "I am afraid not. I have plans this weekend." Daniel let out a short laugh of disbelief. "Plans? Mom? It is just feeding the dog and letting him out a few times." Margaret's voice remained calm. "Then I am sure you will find another solution." Another silence. Longer this time. Then his tone sharpened. "Seriously? We are in the middle of the ocean. Mom, you know how much kennels charge last minute." Margaret turned from the window, her gaze resting on the framed family portrait still sitting on the mantel, and felt something inside her settle into place with absolute certainty. "Yes," she said softly, "and I also know what it feels like to discover you are only remembered when someone needs something." Daniel did not respond immediately. The line had gone so quiet she could hear the distant gulls behind him. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. "Are you really still upset about the cruise?" Margaret closed her eyes briefly, not from pain now, but from the sheer simplicity of the question. Upset, as if humiliation and exclusion were a minor mood she ought to have outgrown by now. "No, Daniel," she said with quiet clarity. "I am not upset about the cruise anymore. I am simply paying attention now." Then she hung up before he could answer. Daniel did not call again that night, but Margaret knew him well enough to understand silence could mean many things. In childhood, it had meant guilt after he broke a lamp and hoped she would not notice. In adulthood, it meant resentment simmering behind forced politeness. Sure enough, he called the next morning. His tone was clipped, overly measured in the way people become when trying to sound reasonable while angry. "Mom, I think you are overreacting." Margaret stood at the kitchen counter slicing peaches for breakfast, her movements unhurried. "Am I?" "Yes," Daniel snapped. "You are acting like we committed some terrible offense because we wanted one vacation with just our household. Families do that all the time." Margaret set down the knife and wiped her hands on a dish towel before answering. "Then perhaps families also understand that excluding someone has consequences." He exhaled sharply. Vanessa was trying to avoid drama. She thought it would be easier if the trip stayed focused on the kids. Margaret let the words hang in the air for a moment, marveling at the audacity of hearing herself reduced to potential inconvenience in her own son's life. "I see," she said. Then I trust she is enjoying the peace she purchased. Daniel's voice hardened. You are making this bigger than it was. Margaret almost laughed. Bigger than it was. As though years of humiliation could be reduced to a scheduling preference. No, Daniel, she replied quietly. I am finally seeing it for exactly what it is. He muttered something under his breath, then changed tactics. Look, this is about the dog. I already found someone else. But the way you are acting is not healthy. You are isolating yourself over one misunderstanding. Margaret's expression did not change, though his words settled in her mind with chilling clarity. That was what he believed this was. Not pain. Not betrayal. Not his mother drawing boundaries after years of being diminished. To Daniel, her refusal to remain convenient had become evidence of instability. Thank you for your concern, she said calmly. Enjoy the rest of your trip. She hung up before he could continue. When they returned from vacation 3 days later, Margaret knew because Vanessa posted another smiling photograph online captioned, Home sweet home after the perfect getaway. There was no mention of conflict. No sign that anything had changed. That Sunday afternoon, Daniel arrived at Margaret's house alone. He walked in carrying the key she had given him years ago, as if the house were still an extension of his own life. Margaret was in the sunroom reading when he entered. We need to talk, he said without preamble. She set down her book carefully. Then sit. He remained standing. Vanessa is hurt. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Is she? She thinks you have been cold and passive-aggressive ever since the trip. You embarrassed us with the dog situation. And now you are acting distant with the kids. Margaret regarded him for a long moment. Daniel, do you hear yourself? He frowned. What does that mean? It means your wife excluded me from a family vacation, publicly pretended I was included, and then sent you to complain that I am not warm enough afterward. His jaw tightened. You are twisting this. No, Margaret said softly. I am describing it accurately for the first time. Daniel paced once across the room, the same way Harold used to when angry but trying to appear composed. Vanessa thinks you have never liked her. Margaret almost smiled at that. Daniel, your wife does not care whether I like her. She cares whether I obey the role she assigned me. He stared at her. That is ridiculous. Margaret stood then, slowly, with all the calm dignity of a woman who had spent decades mastering restraint. No. What is ridiculous is that you expect me to smile while being treated as disposable. Daniel's face flushed. Nobody thinks you are disposable. Margaret met his eyes steadily. Then explain why I am only included when I am useful. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No answer came. For the first time in his adult life, Daniel looked not angry but uncertain, as if some part of him understood that the script had changed and he no longer knew his lines. Margaret picked up her book from the side table and held it against her chest. You may tell Vanessa something from me, she said. If I am not important enough to include in your joys, then I will no longer be available for your conveniences. Then she walked past him toward the kitchen, leaving him standing alone in the sunroom with nothing to argue against except the truth. After Daniel left that afternoon, Margaret stood at the front window and watched him sit in his car for nearly 5 minutes before driving away. He did not look angry anymore. He looked unsettled. Good, she thought. Discomfort was often the first stage of understanding, though she suspected Vanessa would soothe him quickly by reframing the conversation into something easier to digest. She would call Margaret dramatic, sensitive, difficult. That had always been her method. Take another person's pain and rename it until it sounded unreasonable. Margaret no longer cared. The next week passed quietly, but not peacefully. Daniel did not call. Vanessa did not text. The grandchildren, who usually appeared on Margaret's porch at least once a week with backpacks and sticky hands and endless stories from school, were suddenly nowhere to be seen. Margaret noticed the absence immediately, not because she had expected anything different, but because the silence confirmed what she had already begun to understand. Access to the children had never been unconditional love. It had been leverage. She sat in her living room that Thursday afternoon staring at the untouched basket of coloring books and puzzles she kept for them, and for one painful moment the loss nearly broke her resolve. Then her phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa. Since there seems to be tension right now, we think it is best to take some space until emotions settle. Margaret read the message twice and felt a slow chill move through her chest. Not because the threat surprised her, because it was so predictable. Punishment disguised as boundaries. Isolation repackaged as concern. She set the phone down without responding. 2 hours later, Eleanor arrived for coffee and found Margaret standing at the sink, washing a mug that had already been clean. They are keeping the children from you, are they not? Eleanor asked gently. Margaret nodded once. Eleanor's face hardened. Then they just told you exactly who they are. Margaret knew she was right. The children had become bargaining chips, to be granted or withheld depending on Margaret's willingness to remain compliant. It hurt more than the cruise, more than the lies. But pain, she was learning, could either weaken a woman or sharpen her. By Saturday morning, Daniel called again. Margaret answered on the third ring. Mom. He began stiffly. We need to talk about this because Vanessa is very upset. Margaret looked out at the backyard, where wind stirred the roses against the fence. Then perhaps Vanessa should reflect on why. He ignored that. The kids are asking why you have not called. Margaret nearly smiled at the wording. Not why they had not visited. Why she had not called. Another quiet attempt to make distance appear mutual. Because your wife announced she needed space. Margaret replied. Daniel exhaled sharply. She only said that because you have been punishing us. Margaret turned from the window. Punishing you? Yes. Withholding help. Acting cold. Making everyone uncomfortable. This is not like you. There it was again. The real offense, in his mind, was not exclusion. It was that Margaret had changed the rules. No, she said evenly. What is unfamiliar to you is seeing me behave as though I respect myself. Silence crackled over the line. Then Daniel spoke more carefully, adopting the patient tone people use when they think they are being generous. Mom, if you would just apologize for overreacting, we can put this behind us. Margaret laughed then, softly but genuinely, because the absurdity of it struck her all at once. Apologize. For noticing. For objecting. For refusing to remain useful while unwanted. Daniel, she said, her voice calm enough to make his sound childish by comparison. You excluded me from your family, lied about it publicly, punished me for objecting, and now expect me to apologize for not enjoying the experience. Is that truly your position? He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, the patience was gone. I think you are trying to destroy this family over your pride. Margaret's expression did not change. No, she said quietly. I think I spent too many years preserving this family by swallowing my dignity. Then she ended the call. That night, she took the basket of coloring books from the living room and placed it in the hall closet. Not because she had given up hope of seeing her grandchildren again, but because she had finally accepted that loving them did not require allowing their parents to control her with access to them. And if Daniel and Vanessa intended to teach their children that love was conditional and respect flowed only one way, then Margaret decided she would teach a different lesson by example. Even grandmothers were allowed to walk away from people who mistook kindness for weakness. 3 weeks passed before Margaret heard from them again. And when the call finally came, it arrived with such perfect timing that she almost admired the predictability of it. Daniel's name lit up her phone on a Tuesday morning, while she was trimming hydrangeas by the front walk. She wiped her hands on her gardening gloves before answering. "Good morning, Daniel." His voice was warmer than it had been in weeks, almost cheerful. "Hey, Mom. I wanted to see if you were free for dinner Friday. We thought it might be nice to get together and move past all this." Margaret glanced down at the roses blooming beside the porch, smiling faintly to herself. There it was. Not remorse. Not accountability. A vague invitation to move past all this, as if pain disappeared simply because the people causing it grew tired of hearing about it. "That sounds lovely," she said pleasantly. "What time?" Friday evening arrived with all the polished normalcy of theater. Daniel and Vanessa appeared at her front door with the children in tow and a bottle of wine as though no weeks of silence had occurred. Vanessa wore her usual bright smile, the one she reserved for situations where witnesses might someday ask whether she had tried to make peace. The grandchildren ran to Margaret immediately, wrapping themselves around her legs and filling the foyer with laughter so sweet it nearly weakened her resolve. But Margaret kissed their foreheads, welcomed everyone inside, and kept her expression warm and unreadable. Dinner passed in strained civility. Vanessa complimented the roast chicken. Daniel discussed traffic and work, and the children's soccer schedules with exaggerated normalcy. No one mentioned the cruise. No one mentioned the silence that followed. No one mentioned the fact that every sentence felt like furniture arranged over a crack in the floorboards. Then, halfway through dessert, Daniel cleared his throat. Margaret set down her fork. "Here it comes," she thought. "Actually," he began, exchanging a quick glance with Vanessa. "There is something we wanted to talk to you about." Margaret folded her napkin in her lap. "Go on." Vanessa leaned forward. "All practice sweetness. We found an amazing opportunity. A larger home in Brookhaven. Better school district. More yard for the kids. Closer to Daniel's office. But the market is so competitive right now, and we would need to move quickly." Margaret simply looked at her. Daniel took over. "We are a little short on the down payment. Not by much. About $120,000. He said it with the casual tone of someone asking to borrow sugar. Margaret blinked once. "I see." Vanessa nodded eagerly. "We figured family helps family. And after everything, it would mean so much to start fresh." Margaret almost laughed at the phrasing. Start fresh. As if reconciliation were merely the prelude to a financial request. She took a slow sip of coffee before setting the cup down carefully on its saucer. "No," she said. The room went still. Daniel frowned as if he had not heard correctly. "No?" Margaret met his eyes. "No. I will not be contributing to your house purchase." Vanessa's smile faltered instantly. "Margaret, perhaps you misunderstood. This is not a gift exactly. We would pay you back over time." Margaret turned to her with a composure so complete it made Vanessa's forced pleasantness seem frantic by comparison. "No, dear. I understood perfectly." Daniel's voice sharpened. "Mom, we are talking about your grandchildren here. This would benefit them too." Margaret nodded. "Which is precisely why I have already made arrangements that benefit them directly." Daniel's brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" Margaret stood, walked calmly to the credenza in the dining room, and returned with a sealed envelope. She placed it in front of him. "It means I recently updated my estate planning." Daniel stared at the envelope without touching it. Vanessa's face lost color first. Margaret's voice remained gentle, almost conversational. "I have redirected the majority of my estate into protected trusts for the children. Educational use only. Managed independently. Inaccessible to either parent." Daniel looked up sharply. "You did what?" Margaret's gaze did not waver. "I made certain my grandchildren will be cared for without their future depending on whether their parents remember I exist when there is no bill to pay." Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. Daniel's face had gone pale with disbelief. Margaret folded her hands before her and delivered the truth with the same calm she had carried through every insult They once believed she would endure forever. If I am not family enough to stand beside you in joy, then I am certainly not family enough to finance your lifestyle. No one at the table moved. Even the children, sensing the shift in the room, had gone quiet. And in that silence, for the first time, Daniel and Vanessa looked at Margaret not as the dependable woman who would smooth things over, but as someone they no longer knew how to control. Daniel stared at the envelope as if it contained something poisonous. Vanessa recovered first, because women like her often did. She let out a brittle laugh and leaned back in her chair with false disbelief. Surely this is some kind of joke. Margaret folded her hands neatly on the tablecloth. No, dear. It is simply the result of careful thought. Daniel's face flushed a deep, angry red. You changed your will because of one argument? Margaret met his stare with infuriating calm. No, Daniel. I changed it because of years of behavior that one argument finally forced me to acknowledge. Vanessa's polished mask cracked then. This is unbelievable. After everything we have done to include you. Margaret raised one hand, and Vanessa stopped speaking. Not because Margaret shouted. Not because she threatened. Simply because for the first time, the room bent around Margaret's authority instead of Vanessa's performance. Do not insult my intelligence by rewriting history in my home, Margaret said quietly. The children sat frozen at the far end of the table, wide-eyed and confused. Margaret softened her voice before continuing. Not for Daniel or Vanessa, but for them. Your parents asked for my help tonight because they believed I would continue funding a life they no longer feel obligated to include me in. I declined. That is all. Daniel pushed back from the table so abruptly his chair scraped against the hardwood. You are punishing us because you are bitter. Margaret remained seated. No. I am adjusting my generosity to reflect reality. Reality? He snapped. Reality is that you are willing to tear this family apart over your pride. Margaret's eyes did not leave his. No. Daniel. The family began tearing apart the moment you learned to benefit from my love, while offering none in return. Silence swallowed the room. Even Vanessa seemed to understand there was no easy manipulation left to attempt. Daniel grabbed the envelope at last, glancing through the documents with frantic disbelief. You cannot be serious. Margaret rose from her chair then, smooth and unhurried, and began gathering dessert plates as if the matter had already concluded. I have never been more serious in my life. Vanessa stood next. Her voice cold now, all sweetness abandoned. Come on, Daniel. Clearly she wants to make us beg. Margaret turned toward her, a plate in each hand. No, Vanessa. I simply reached the age where peace matters more to me than being liked by people who only value what I provide. Daniel looked at her then with something new in his face. Not anger. Not guilt. Fear. Because in that moment, he understood this was permanent. The woman who had always forgiven him before he asked, who had always made excuses for him before he offered any, was gone. In her place stood someone quieter, colder, and infinitely harder to manipulate. He swallowed hard. So that is it? You're just done with us? Margaret's expression softened, but not enough to suggest surrender. No, Daniel. I am done financing disrespect. There is a difference. He stared at her for several long seconds, perhaps waiting for the old Margaret to reappear. The one who would rush to smooth things over at the sight of his disappointment. She did not. Finally he grabbed his jacket and snapped for the children to get their things. Vanessa swept from the room without another word. The grandchildren hugged Margaret tightly before leaving, confused and reluctant, and she kissed each of them with all the tenderness she still carried in her heart. Then the front door closed, and silence settled over the house once more. Margaret stood alone in her dining room surrounded by half-eaten dessert and overturned emotions, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. She carried the dishes to the sink, rolled up her sleeves, and began washing them one by one while moonlight spilled across the kitchen floor. Her phone buzzed once with a text from Eleanor. How did dinner go? Margaret smiled faintly and typed back, better than the cruise. Then she set the phone down and looked around the home she had built, the life she had preserved, the dignity she had nearly traded away for people who mistook devotion for weakness. They would tell others she had changed. They would call her difficult, proud, cold. Let them. The truth was simpler than that. Margaret had not become cruel. She had simply stopped begging for a seat at tables she had built with her own hands.